kind of keep it on the postcard view until it's time.
Yeah, here we go.
Double postcard, back to back.
Let's do it. Let's get that video up. There we go. And the video is live. We can see Science World in beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, with the SkyTrain going by. And we should be starting the 7 o'clock healthcare cheer pretty darn quickly.
Yeah. Oh, the pots. A few preliminary bangs on a pot across the street there. There it is. And it begins. Some folks way up there. I see some streamer action. Some pots banging. There's somebody applauding over there. Definitely a little quieter tonight than it has been. I guess that's not surprising. What are we, episode 12?
Episode 12, yeah.
Going. Now we got folks down in the park having an appropriately socially distanced picnics. Cheering. A couple nights ago, it was all just boat horns and cannons. It was amazing. More subdued tonight than we've been experiencing lately.
I think people have got a few other things on their mind.
Possibly. Yeah. Tonight's episode, I might get angry when I'm actually talking about the scientific research that I've dug up. But I don't want to steal my thunder here when we're kind of focusing on praise for healthcare workers who are still battling. But it's not the only front in this war. There's another big front that opened up 2 weeks ago, and that's going to be a really important focus tonight.
Yeah, we can definitely hear that now.
Nice. Ah, there we go. I'm not sure what that person bangs on. It sounds like a mason jar with a drumstick, but it's a sound I've definitely become used to. All right.
I'm not hearing the air horns here tonight.
No air horn, no. Here comes the postcard view. Viral Transmissions promise. Once a week, you will get a postcard view on our show.
You're going to have to get a good... Rob, we should make Viral Transmission postcards. You should take a high-quality picture of that sometime.
Being attacked. We should turn Science World into a coronavirus.
Oh, stick the little things sticking out of it. Yeah. And then ritualistically burn it to release a bunch of our tension? No, wait. I take that idea back. Don't burn Science World.
Let's not burn Science World. Science World is part of the solution. It is part of the solution.
Here's hope.
All right. I'm going to head back in now.
Okay.
See you all inside shortly.
So let's go back to the three of us. There we go. And I can prep our names for when Rob is back. So while Rob's doing that, let me just go through our welcome then. Greetings, guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'm Joe Fulgham. Welcome to Viral Transmissions, episode number 12. Joining me tonight is Dr. Rob Tarswell. Torrin Atkinson is, I think, currently in a vehicle right now trying to get home. He might be able to join us later. We're not so sure what his timing's going to be on that. Our guest tonight is Dr. Simon Pratt, who's returning for a second visit with us. Viral Transmissions is still supported in part by the BC Humanist Association. Learn more about them at bchumanist.ca. And again, big thumbs up about the BC Humanist Association from us, not just for supporting us. They really are. I'm not a person who likes to join groups of people because they always disappoint. But so far, BC Humanists has been like top notch to me. Big fan. So good for them. Rob, take it away.
So back with us tonight, we've got our Bristol lecturer, Dr. Simon Pratt, and Wow, so much to talk about tonight. Our episode tonight is called Black Lives Matter, and the first thing is to point out, wow, why are there three white faces talking about how Black Lives Matter? And I think the first thing is to acknowledge that um, we were, as a show, unprepared for issues that affect Black people. So, in a sense, this is our blind spot kind of exposed.
Hmm.
And having blind spots like that is very much part of the problem of systemic racism and the perpetuation of that. And our part of undoing that is to kind of own that error and admit, okay, we were caught unprepared, and we were unprepared simply from a lack of uh, Black individuals in our personal networks and Black organizations in our professional networks, as professional as this is. And we need to change, and we're going to change that. So I just want to kind of put that out there to be accountable about it right up front.
Yeah.
And Dr. Pratt, you have some things to say from the political science point of view, particularly about mass protest, police, and without wanting to steal any more of your thunder, using that phrase twice tonight, why don't you just lead off?
Um, well, let me start by saying that I was initially a little uncomfortable accepting your invitation on fairly short notice to come on today. It's true that because of my research and teaching background, I probably have some knowledge or perspective to contribute here. I really do think that the role that I'm playing now could be better played by an activist or scholar of color, especially in the Canadian context, the Black or Indigenous scholar. And it's certainly a problem that what we have today is an episode on the problems of racism and the experiences of non-white people, and what we have are three white men talking about it.
Yeah.
Um, and your invitation to me also asked if I knew anybody who could take my spot. And what I didn't want to do was on short notice start reaching out to the non-white scholars in my professional and personal network and ask them to come up with a perspective and to appear in a professional capacity on like 3 hours notice and perform labor that I think you guys should have been in a position to perform 2 weeks ago. And um, you know, on the one hand, this isn't a personal attack. This is a problem that most platforms have, is that they're unable to dig up any other, anyone else than white men. But also, I know you and I respect you, and I am a little disappointed, particularly because the, it isn't just a question of issues that it's not like specific issues affect racialized groups and other issues don't. Actually, we should all be more aware of the way that race is a dimension of anything, and especially public health. And so, given the focus of this podcast, I'm just little bit surprised that these connections weren't made quite some time ago, and with the effort that they probably warranted.
I think you're absolutely right.
That is, yeah, what I can say to that other than owning it and before you and before the public saying, yeah, we're going to do better.
Okay, well, I said my bit, and I do appreciate the opportunity to come on and share my perspective.
Thanks. Yeah, thank you for that.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead,
No,
Joe.
I was just going to try to fill it. If you have something to say,
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah. So I think that there are two um, constellations of issues I want to kind of orbit around tonight. One that I'm more comfortable with is specifically looking at the public health and medical, specifically the medical aspects of what's happening in terms of protest behavior, police response, and the impact on coronavirus transmission, which is specifically in relation to some of the tactics being used, including in particular CS or tear gas, and then looking at the other thing I'd like to orbit around are the social and political meanings and aspects of this, where we're valuing your perspective. So it's probably going to be, I hope, a nice back and forth on these issues. So maybe I'll sort of start off. The research I've done has been surprising to me. In 2012, in a journal, not surprisingly called Military Medicine, July 2014, a paper was published where military physicians looked at the rates of acute respiratory infections in basic Army trainees before and after exposure to tear gas training. Because as I can attest, I was an Air Force officer, I went through this. You get trained on how to handle poison gas, and that training is conducted with tear gas, which actually isn't a gas, it's a fine powder that can be dispersed in a number of methods. And you're trained how to recognize when you're subject to a gas attack and your immediate actions to make yourself safe, clean yourself of material, and then get into your gas mask. And what these investigators wanted to know was, is there a relationship between tear gas exposure and increased rates of respiratory illness, specifically infectious respiratory illness? And they found that in young, healthy men in the absolute prime of life, so the average Army basic training candidate is sort of an 18 or 19-year-old man. These guys were 2.4 times more likely to present to a medical unit complaining of respiratory illness in the 2 to 3 weeks after an exposure to tear gas versus before an exposure to tear gas. And the reason they did their work, and this was on 6,400 recruits, by the way, this wasn't a small study. They basically tracked the rate over time through several batches of basic training over about an 18-month period. And this went back to clinical observations from the early 90s from a Royal Army doctor, or I think maybe a Royal Navy doctor, who first reported on an outbreak suddenly of respiratory illness in a group of Royal Marines after exposure to CS tear gas. And CS has been the number one agent that's been used in riot and crowd control through the last 2 weeks in the U.S., whereas in fact we've had knowledge now going back almost 30 years that this material increases susceptibility significantly to respiratory illness. And I think there's that has enormous moral and potentially legal implications. And I just find it just ghastly and horrifying that there's willful use of a compound that increases your risk of contracting a deadly virus.
Yeah, and this is not something anybody's talking about. We like when you talked about this before the show and started bringing up what you were going to talk about. I was kind of blown away that this message that I haven't seen anybody in the news talk about, even asking the question, does tear gas cause a problem like for increasing the infection rates of COVID? Like once you even ask it, you go, oh geez, it probably does, and then it turns out. Yeah.
So may I point out that actually the activist networks that I've been following have been discussing this for some time. Okay. And I don't believe that anyone in these networks is familiar with the research showing an increased risk of respiratory infection after exposure to CS gas. So I think that's a fantastic bit of digging you've done, Rob, and I think that we should probably try to publicize this and provide that research material to those networks. But there's a lot of concern over how the gas causes respiratory disease after exposure, and what that's likely to do in packed crowds or in subsequent detention.
Well, this kind of brings up another important medical issue, right? So We know that there's increased, setting aside gas, crowding is a risk factor for exposure to the virus. Anything that increases droplet production is a risk factor for exposure to the virus. So the paradigm before 2 weeks ago, the thing you want to avoid is the thing that's like a church service. So a thing that's indoors and involves singing, which is a loud, projective kind of an activity, and which involves crowding. Um, the sort of the three C's, right? Stay away from that. And now we have situations where we've had crowds, right? Where I think to the degree possible, as far as I can tell, there's been widespread use of masks. It looks to me like in film and in still photos. Um, Anytime that there's activity, there's encouragement to use masks, to be safe, to be aware that there is a deadly virus and operating in our communities. Hand sanitizer is also talked about. It's widely available. But then you get these situations where there's, things like kettling, which Simon, maybe you can describe in more detail. But essentially, it's basically forcing a crowd and then launching tear gas into a crowd that has no method of escape. And one of the first things that tear gas does once it gets into your airway is it causes involuntary coughing. So there's going to be massive increase in production of respiratory droplets. And now consider that in combination with the elevated risk of the elevated risk of contracting a respiratory illness. And then individuals are arrested and bussed off to non-hygienic detention facilities where they can be held 24 hours longer. And I think we have a potential recipe for super spreading events that are just, we'll see in 2 weeks what happens, but I think we may see numbers that are hard to imagine in terms of the number of new infections.
Yeah, I mean, so a couple of things strike me about, many things strike me about the sorts of crowd control measures that police forces across the United States are using. I've noticed from looking at videos of demonstrations, and protests in the U.S. that actually it's certainly not ubiquitous, and I think Canada is better on that front. But a lot of people are wearing masks, making some effort not to be packed in too far together. Clearly, there's a sense that the political moment obliges one to take risks in a pandemic scenario. It obliges one to get out on the streets and raise your voice, and that entails certain risks. But it entails far fewer risks than the crowd control measures, which include the use of irritants like pepper spray, which also cause you to touch your eyes, a lot of tears. You'll cough if you get pepper spray, right? It's not just CS gas. And presumably people, once they're detained, their masks are stripped away, right? So not only are they packed into in crowds into cells in detention, or in paddy wagons, right, in police vans, kind of all sitting together, but they probably are denied any kind of barriers over the mouth. So, all of these measures would be horrible and disproportionate and monstrously violent, even were a pandemic not taking place, because the scale of police repression that we're seeing, very well documented, completely outstrips any reasonable anything reasonable, right? Like there's we have so many videos of police just laying into totally non-threatening, totally non-violent crowds of people, right? But in the circumstances of a pandemic, it makes it especially clear how little the police seem to care, and also how carceral measures of detention, how these measures and these processes are actually, they're a gigantic public health risk. Prisons are a gigantic public health risk, and what the pandemic makes more acute or throws into greater relief is something that is structurally been there. It's always been there, So I'm glad that we're seeing it, but I'm just a little concerned about attributing the public health risks to incidental police tactics rather than understanding how they are the outcome of well institutionalized carceral measures.
Yeah, so what you're saying is that this is making worse a problem that was already, like, it's not just that it's making it worse, but
Yes.
this problem has always been there, and now because of the
Yes.
pandemic it's becoming a much, it's a multiplier though, is what we're seeing, right? Rob,
Yes,
what
exactly.
Rob, you said, was it 2 to 3 or 2.3 times as many?
2.4 times they
2.4.
noticed, in the 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks after the exposure versus before the exposure.
And wow. Yeah, this is a potential explosion of COVID
Right.
infections.
Yeah. Linked to
And
force. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead, sir.
what another thing that stands out to me here, and I'm not claiming there's a conspiracy or there's any deliberate desire to create super spreader events, but I also, I don't think the people who decide on these crowd control measures are unusually stupid, right? So I think that these dynamics of enhanced infection probably haven't escaped them, but it's in their interests for protests to look like irresponsible public health acts, right? It's in the interests of people
Mm-hmm.
who don't want protests to take place to be able to get on the news and say, "Wow, all of these people, they went out there and they exposed themselves, and it was very irresponsible of them." So that might explain why there's so little attention paid
Mm-hmm.
to mitigating the enhanced harms of these measures.
Uh, as infection rates do spike among detained individuals, right, in the next 2 weeks. So watch for this to become a political football on Fox News,
Yeah.
coming soon to a TV near you.
The
And
bully thing. Why are you hurting yourself? Why are you hurting yourself? It's the same thing.
and
They'll blame the protesters for putting themselves in harm's way.
And the
Where,
way you can resist this narrative, by the way, is looking at is comparing infection rates between localities where there were large protests but a restrained police response, and those localities where the
mm-hmm.
police really took the gloves off. And I think that you will see pronounced differences in infection.
That sounds 100% right to me. Yeah. Yeah.
So that'll be sort of watch.
You're not going to have those people coughing from tear gas if you didn't lob tear gas. You're not going to have people kettled together if the police didn't kettle them together. And all of those are just, as we've discussed, giant multipliers of the problem.
Yeah. And in fact, another article that I was looking at. Oh, where was I hope I still have it. It because of the. I can't find it. I can't find the quote. I think I sent it out to you earlier. But essentially, even the U.S. military, which had assumed that it was using occupationally safe amounts of tear gas, and it already uses quite constricted amounts versus the amounts that might get launched in a protest. Um, they discovered that there were several occupational health and safety violations, and as a result, were required to curtail their use even farther. I'm sure I've got this quote around here somewhere, and by God, I'm going to find it.
Well, while you
Um,
look for that, let me
Here we
talk.
go. Yeah.
Did you find it?
Exposure levels considered for many years safe and necessary for training were determined to far exceed the National Institute for Occupational and Safety and Health and Occupational Safety and Health Administration safety levels. These findings led to immediate measures limiting exposure concentrations and times, improving decontamination procedures, and imposing frequent hygiene and health monitoring. So that's what they do when they're exposing Army and police trainees to this material. It is absolutely not what they do when they use this material for crowd dispersal.
Can anybody think of a time when, especially in these protests, when they've used tear gas and you've been like, well, they needed to use tear gas there because, like, I can't, it never seems even like, well, that was a time you needed to do that, because the only outcome I've seen from tear gas are stampedes and people who were peaceful just having to rush and crush each other everywhere. Like, I don't. What are they saying is their reason for the tear gas, I guess, is my question.
So, I mean, tear gas is a fairly aggressive crowd policing measure, and arguably it should not be a legal crowd policing measure at all. I mean, somewhat ironically, if protests were so violent that they counted as acts of armed conflict, it would be illegal under international laws of armed conflict to use gas, right?
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure there are legal intricacies to this argument that escape me, but in a sort of when your ethical and legal frameworks for regulating the conflict of states and parties to an armed conflict prohibit the use of tear gas, that sort of suggests to me that maybe gas is actually just generally unnecessary. But in particular, the fact that gas seems a first resort in many cases is striking to me, because it suggests that that sort of police forces have already ditched or can't be bothered to employ less aggressive measures, and that the kind of process of escalation in the use of crowd control measures has been short-circuited. So it's going from zero to 100 pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I've also seen videos showing gas used in ways that really can only be understood as the deliberate torturing of protesters without any kind of broader crowd control function. For example, I've seen videos of protests pinned against embankments or other places where they can't disperse, or flee, having gas lobbed at them, and at that point they just remain in a cloud of tear gas for a prolonged period of time. And never mind whether this is completely against any sort of occupational health and safety policy within the police or armed forces. This obviously is cannot be justified under any standards of necessity or proportionality.
Torture at that point.
Yes.
And it's torture that provides or creates an especially high level of risk, because when this material is in a situation where dispersion is not easy and escape is not easy, then that's when we get into elements like somebody who has asthma out in that crowd going into an acute asthma attack and potentially respiratory arrest. It's these concentration issues, and tear gas alone, CS on its own, is capable of being lethal. There's during Arab Spring, there was an incident where tear gas was discharged into a vehicle containing 37 detainees, and all 37 died. So this is not a benign material at all. And there's a reason it's used in Army training, is to send you immediate feedback about what you could be exposed to in a field of battle, and how important it is to take countermeasures seriously. It's a very, very self-reinforcing kind of a material to work with in terms of whether you're doing it right or wrong.
Yeah, and this is why I think a lot of these measures are properly called less lethal rather than non-lethal.
Mm-hmm.
The same especially goes with the use of rubber or plastic bullets. These things can kill, and these things, especially when aimed at the head, same with tear gas canisters, can cause serious damage to the skull, can cause destroyed eyes. And I've seen videos of police pointing their launchers directly at people's faces, including at point blank range. But one thing that I would like to discourage is a fixation on the excessive or monstrous crowd control measures. To me, the fact that police have moved to these measures so quickly and ubiquitously indicates something deeper and more deeply embedded within the institutions of police in the U.S. And you know, now that people who look like us are getting gassed or mistreated or assaulted by police at protests, we can go, oh wow, actually the police are monsters. But the routine violence, the routine, the sort of shameless, unpunished routine violence of policing in the U.S. is something that non-white communities and especially Black communities have existed with since the birth of police forces in the U.S. Right? That this is actually something that is part of how policing works, part of how it works, how colonial policing works. It's part of how imperial policing works, and that and imperial policing practices have been part of American police forces since their inception.
Yeah, and Canada's not much better. Like, we don't want to just think we're sitting here just pointing fingers. There, black people in Toronto are 20 times more likely to be shot dead by the police than white people. We treat our Indigenous population, which we call First Nations here, terribly. We have an entire thing going on with Canadian police forces and the murdered and missing Indigenous women that just still we haven't put enough into investigating and figure out what's going on there.
A woman just killed by police in New Brunswick on the weekend, an Indigenous woman from Vancouver who had relocated to New Brunswick, and police were called for what's called a wellness check, which is somebody is agitated or exhibiting some kind of psychiatric distress, and the police are sent to intervene. And allegedly, this individual charged the police officer with a knife and was shot dead. So unfortunately, we'll never hear the other witnesses' account of what actually happened. We only have the police account at this stage. But we do know statistically that in Canada, Black, Brown, and Indigenous individuals are 40% more likely to not survive police wellness checks. So yeah, this is a Canadian issue as well.
So let's talk about the idea of a wellness check for a moment. So Hamilton, the city of Hamilton, piloted a program to send mental health professionals along with police on calls where a mental health professional may be in a position to help someone. And this, to me, raises the question of why men in uniforms with guns are sent to resolve problems or check up on people in distress in situations where you really don't need people who are equipped for violence, who are there to confront violence. And when you put people when you put an armed man wearing a uniform into a situation where someone is in distress, you exacerbate that situation. You provoke a violent response, and then these people, and then the outcome is less surprising that somebody dies.
Yeah.
And we already know from plenty of evidence in psychology and criminology and historical precedent that these situations they don't have to turn out like this. If you send a civilian, someone who's not in a uniform, someone who's not carrying weapons, who knows how to handle someone in crisis, if you send someone like that into this situation, people don't die.
Yeah, you had said they sent a mental health professional along with the cops on the wellness checks, and my first thought was, well, why bother sending the cops with them at all? Like, shouldn't we just have people whose job it is as mental health professionals to do these wellness checks? Because I know that wellness checks, I have had friends who are at risk of mental health issues drop off the radar and wanted to make sure that they're okay. So I understand the need for a wellness check a lot of the time. But yeah, like I 100% agree with you. Why send a person with a lethal firearm on a wellness check? I don't understand why our cops carry lethal firearms, period. Like, now that I think about it, like...
Yeah, and his response is the so-called use of force continuum, which is when you're confronted with someone who's agitated, who's going to be often somewhat kinetic and somewhat loud. Oh, well, they're loud. So the use of force continuum says I need to get louder and I need to make this person immediately comply with silence and with not moving. Oh, well, they're still agitated. Well, now I can intervene physically. And, oh, this person is grabbing at me. Well, now I can respond with a weapon. And so, boom, 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 boom. And oh, looks like we've lost Simon. Let's hope he finds his way back in shortly. But the use of force continuum is almost a precise tool to ensure that an agitated individual who isn't capable of listening in the moment is very quickly going to end up at the far end, the dangerous end of that spectrum.
Welcome back, Simon.
Sorry, a thing happened. So let me pick up on that question that Joe raised, which is why are police armed at all, and and also the issue of the use of force continuum, the desire to impose compliance by getting loud and kinetic. So the answer to that question is that police forces in North America arose not to deal with individuals who are being disorderly or dangerous, but to deal with the political problem of labor action and strikes and organized crime. And so, right from the very beginning, I mean, or to deal with escaped slaves in the case of the U.S. and in Canada, I mean, the RCMP is a sort of classic colonial militarized constabulary, right? It massed and went to battle with rebels, right? So these legacies leave their mark on the institutions and the cultures of policing. If the origin of policing is to shut down strikes, to bust groups of people who are not complying with the dictates of municipal government or of government, right? Or if your policing practices take on styles of military training because your municipalities have appointed military officers to command them and to professionalize them, then it is very unsurprising that that police carry weapons, that police understand their role as the generation of compliance and obedience with social norms and with laws, rather than the creation of a well community, or the creation of a community that is just and in which there is justice available to people who have been wronged.
Yeah. So how do we fix that? Do we have to convince enough people, again, who I guess look like us, how wrong this is, and then do we just get our politicians to fix it? Is that we hear defund the police is happening a lot, which even for myself is a relatively new thing that I've heard, which I think talks about a lot of what you've been hinting at here, which is not having militarized police respond to all sorts of these social things where we don't need basically what is a little municipal soldier to show up at these interactions. We need healthcare workers or social workers or somebody like that in place of police. Do you feel, how do you feel about that kind of solution?
The evidence show.
So let's talk about what abolition is and what it implies. So abolition has a certain resonance, particularly within Black communities, because of its association with the abolition of segregation and the abolition of slavery. So abolition doesn't just mean, abolitionism isn't like cancel culture, right? Like abolition is about radically shrinking, reforming, or replacing particular institutional arrangements with something better. And when we talk about abolition, we're also trying to reach past our imaginative horizons. So if it sounds like there's a certain degree of utopianism involved in the idea of a society without police, part of that is just because it's difficult to imagine a more just society. But the abolition of police needs to come along with the abolition of prisons, or at least the radical shrinkage and reformation of the way that we deal with punishment. Because it isn't just that interactions with police tend to be much more violent and much more frequent for non-white people, but also imprisonment, incarceration, recidivism, all of the all of these problems are linked. There's a sort of constellation of criminal justice interaction and violence and racism that has the function of harming all of us, but harming certain communities in particular. And so the way to mitigate this harm isn't just to defund the police, although I think that's a pretty good first step. It isn't just to start sending mental health professionals on calls instead of municipal soldiers. It's to look for different ways of resolving conflict. Look for different understandings of what order and justice mean in practice.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Rob?
In the chat here, I'm noticing Marvin 61688. Militarization of the police has been a concern of mine for a long time. When my hometown of 4,000 got a fully armored assault truck for the sheriff, I knew it was going too far. Ischemial from New York. Cops aren't even routinely taught basic de-escalation techniques. They say it's for safety that they have cops go with mental health providers in New York City. Not that it happens frequently. 9 out of 10 times, the only person in danger of being hurt is the person the wellness check is for.
Mm-hmm.
Also, back to an earlier part of the conversation, Schemiel has said that the masks are being taken away. I've had people tell me they had masks taken away by police after arrests, and I believe it was Friday or Thursday that a judge in New York indicated that police could be holding individuals arrested in protests for over 24 hours. So habeas corpus has been suspended in New York, which is legally and ethically pretty serious problem, but also a wonderful opportunity if you are a coronavirus looking for new hosts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what I think. So, like many political scientists, I, I study counterinsurgency and militarized police forces in other places, right? Places that are experiencing protracted civil uprisings or are experiencing protracted insurgencies, and so the U.S. police response is very familiar to us, and we have the language to talk about it. We're just really surprised that we're now talking about it with reference to the U.S. But this surprise also reflects, or at least in my case, it reflects my own ignorance, which I'm currently working on, of the history and nature of policing in the U.S. And also to a large degree in Canada. And the extraordinary violence of the police response, to me, is because the police their institutional position is threatened by these protests. And there is a paper floating around, which I don't know if it's passed review yet. Oh, actually, no, it has. A paper that I've recently seen, which shows that police are much more likely to be aggressive and violent in their repression of protests when those protests are against police violence, right? So this, to me, is counterinsurgency, right? The protests are seen as an uprising against a certain order of things, not merely people upset over an issue, but people upset over an arrangement, people upset over a regime, and they want. And it's certainly possible for nonviolent protests to still be a serious threat to a given order of things. In this case, a racist, carceral, militarized order of things. And so the police response looks like counterinsurgency to me. And if that's what it looks like, then that tells you what these protests could be, what they represent. And also, I mean, if police feel that their privileged position is this threat by a bunch of people gathering together to demand greater accountability and the exploration of alternatives, then great. We know what we should keep doing more of, right? In terms of the question of like what actually leads to these change, this sort of thing that we're doing now, this is the opening of a campaign that I think has a great deal of potential to be effective if the pressure is sustained, and if this doesn't just cease to be newsworthy after a couple of weeks.
Yeah, I know I think 9 of 13 Minneapolis city council members have at least signed a pledge, so as much as that's worth, to investigate defunding the police. And apparently that is a veto proof amount. But again, it's a pledge. I mean, they could be saying things to just get the protests to stop, but it gives me some hope that and I think a lot of people are getting educated, myself including, on what that defund means, what abolish means. Because your initial thought about it can technically, like I think a lot of people go, what, and replace it with nothing? And that's not the answer. But that sometimes feels like what the answer is when all you hear is abolish, because abolish means to wipe away. But you have to educate yourself about what that replacement is. And I mean, it sounds like we don't even know, but we know that this is super broken. So we need to try something else.
I think if you listen to abolitionists or you read abolitionist writers, they offer some concrete alternatives. Actually, we do know what alternatives we could have in place of the police.
Okay.
We have nascent or poorly explored but existing institutions for transformative justice. We have alternatives for making order, managing disorderly communities or keeping communities safe and respectful that come from within, that employ unarmed officers, that employ methods of community policing or community watch, where you know the engagement between offenders and people who are there to maintain order are engagements between people who are all part of the same community and who have who don't have the right to use violence and who have other measures available to them as a result. I also think that so one of the frustrating things with all of these public statements of support for BLM is so many of them boil down to racism is bad. And what I would really like to see more of, and what I hear many activists and non-white voices saying they'd like to see more of, is more concrete pledges. I'm very proud of my my academic department, my academic unit, for signing on to a letter that didn't just say racism is bad, but said and but committed to some specific measures to increase the recruitment of non-white staff, increase the recruitment of non-white students, try to look for ways of featuring more non-white authors' and perspectives in syllabi, try to create safer and more hospitable spaces for non-white students and staff to better to respond to active complaints of racism in the department and the institution more readily. These once when someone signs their name to this, they've done more than just say racism is bad. They've committed to something, and you can hold people to account if they don't fulfill those commitments. And to me, that's more of a that's more significant, and that stands out to me much more than, I don't know, like 20 seconds of awkward lip smacking silence, so that's supposed to mean something before like a milquetoast condemnation of racism.
Yeah, we've had those condemnations for as long as I've been alive, and apparently it hasn't gotten it much better. So it's time to actually do something. Yeah.
They're surprisingly ineffective. Now, speaking of doing something, and Bristol, I was very pleased to follow the story this morning of the Edward Colston statue, about whom I knew nothing and about which I knew nothing. And let me know if I'm putting you on the spot, but can you tell us a bit about that and just give us your reactions? I know you haven't been in Bristol for long, but perhaps...
Yeah. Great. Get in the fucking sea. Honestly.
He literally is in the sea.
Yeah, well, he's in the River Avon, which feeds into the sea.
Okay.
But
right.
Until somebody fishes him out and sells all the brass for a couple grand of scrap or something. How offensive is it to have statues of slave traders put up around your city because they are wealthy merchants who happen to have sponsored various buildings or initiatives or public works? Yes, Edward Colston was wealthy and influential, and he sold and bought people. And I don't know, like, imagine being being black. Imagine being a descendant of a slave and living in a society where there are statues of people who traded in your ancestors. So I'm glad that that people pulled that statue down. I'm glad they rolled it into the Avon, and the only legitimate reason to ever fish them out would be to sell that statue and donate the proceeds to something useful.
Yeah, agreed. I can't. It's part of my ongoing frustration with humans when people try to defend Confederate and slave owner statues. The backflips and twists that they do in order to try to make it seem like they're being reasonable. Like, how can you? There's the it's history. I'm like, I can't think of a single.
Great history.
I can't. Yeah, we got books for that. Have a
The
picture.
statue erases history.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Have a picture of the statue in the book and say, we got rid of here's some history. We got rid of the shitty statue. This was history. History is our photos of that statue being thrown in the river. Hooray, more history. It's stuff like that where we look at things like abolish policing or change it or transform however we're gonna call it, as being giant steps, and we can't even get the little step of, hey, this guy literally reminds a significant portion of our population about how shitty they're treated every time they see it. Maybe we should take it down, and we have to have we have to have a riot to get rid of it.
Buddy, well, so philanthropic.
So let's talk a little bit about what gets called and what the word riot does for the way our public discourse approaches symbolic acts of property damage, right? So tearing down a statue of a slave trader is not the same kind of action as kicking in some windows and looting some shops.
100%. Yes.
Now, Trevor Noah has a great, widely shared diatribe about how when the police have so completely failed to maintain their end of the social contract, whereby police are given license to use violence, but in return they're supposed to use it only to keep public order. When government and police have completely failed to uphold their end of the bargain, I think the attitude amongst many is, well, why the hell shouldn't we break some windows and take some shit? Nothing else is really happening for us, right? But even if you disapprove of that, and I'm not going to sit here and condemn it, but I'm going to recognize that the vast majority of protesters aren't engaging in it, and recognize that it probably doesn't help their cause, right? I tear down a statue of a racist, but I wouldn't break a window. And what we're seeing with the Bristol protest and the sort of crowd that participated in that is these aren't anarchists, or these aren't seasoned protesters used to symbolic acts of destruction or vandals or whatever. These are people who are legitimately outraged over the persistent existence of institutions and symbols that are profoundly unjust, that represent the persistence of institutions that have never been held to account for the harms that they caused. And tearing down that statue is one small way of indicating a broader will to abolish.
Yep.
It isn't wrecking the statue, it's seeking to abolish what the statue continues to stand for.
Right. And I didn't mean to even put down riots. I'm with you. I think that it's much like cats, I judge them on an individual basis. The last Vancouver Canucks hockey riot was such an embarrassment to me that it soured me on hockey. I haven't cared about hockey since, because it just reminds me of what those fans did with that useless, dumb riot. But I don't feel the same way about the people who are even kicking in windows, which, again, I'm with you. I wouldn't do it. My anger gets pretty focused. But I haven't been in those situations. I am not those people. I have not had their experiences of the world constantly stifling every single outcome other than that they've ever had to express how they feel. So I'm in absolutely no position to judge them for wrecking a building or taking stuff. And then when you compare what they might have stolen out of those riots compared to what our robber baron billionaires are stealing from wages all the time. It's nothing compared to what those people do to fuck up every other person. So I fucking riot, take some shit. I mean, as long as it's not doing bad for the rest of the message that you're doing, which I think is what it feels like it's happened. That there were a bunch of looting type outbreaks in the riot, but now it seems like a lot of the protesters are very specifically stopping them and proactively telling people to not do that, proactively telling people to call out anybody doing that kind of thing. But
I think it's important not to hold, especially with relatively spontaneous and very large mass movements. It's important not to hold the movements responsible for both for the behavior of particular individuals, but also it's important not to hold those individuals responsible for the messages of the movement. I don't think the people who have committed acts of vandalism or looting, I mean, some of them are opportunistic, sure, but I also don't think it's fair to attribute their actions to a kind of generalized rage at a world that keeps them down. I think these people are, I think people who are committing acts of violence might be very well aware of who specifically is oppressing them, who specifically, whose actions specifically they'd like to see changed, and 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 acts of property damage or theft don't necessarily indicate an unsophisticated or poorly informed sense of what social problems need to be resolved.
okay.
An interesting
Yeah.
question that's arising. I know a common position that authority takes on protests is these are outside agitators, which is a great way of saying, see, there's no problem here in our community. And as we've seen now that there are protests in all 50 states and in more than 50 countries around the world, where where are these outside agitators coming from? But there are also very sophisticated networks of right-wing extremists who have been agitating for what they're calling Boogaloo, which is the second civil war. And they have badges, they have identifiers, they have methods, tactics, and training. And there's film of them engaging in these kinds of behaviors. And I think of things like the Proud Boys or other groups. And to what degree are they operating under the cover of protest to try and basically spark race war? And can you kind of riff on that?
I think that's a really good question to bring up. I've been trying to focus my comments on the institutionalized structures of racism and police militarization rather than the particular way that these protests are unfolding, because I believe that this protest is a symptom of those deeper structures and problems. But scholars of terrorism and people in the national security sort of scholarship community are paying very close attention to how right-wing extremist groups in the U.S. are capitalizing on the situation to try to exacerbate the police response. We call them accelerationists. But I would say that the people trying to ignite a new civil war are not the same as the Proud Boys, right? The Proud Boys are a kind of organized fascist street fighting militia, and they show up with shields and clubs and helmets, and they get into fights with left-wing activists. Portland has a kind of almost institutionalized weekly confrontation between Antifa, like street fighters, and Proud Boys, right? The people attending protests in Hawaiian shirts and plate carriers and rifles are not Proud Boys, and they're not there to get into street fights. Some of them are there to maybe start shooting at police, right? They're sort of there because what they actually want is for a civil war to erupt along the racial line. And some of them are sort of variety of libertarian, where they're actually supportive of protesting against the police and the government, so they claim to be there to defend protesters. And others just sort of seem to be there to look menacing and be nefarious, or to just get, just to to engage in the act of showing up and brandishing arms itself in the hopes that it will inflame things. They aren't especially well organized, and it's hard to talk about them as an organization, but there's certainly a movement behind it.
Speaking of Proud Boys, there was some video of, I forget what city it was in, but a police officer asking some Proud Boys, basically warning them that some tear gas was going to be fired and asking them to wait inside. Otherwise, they would get exposed to the gas, and he needed to kind of ask them this in this way so that it didn't appear as though the police were exercising favoritism. Have you seen that video?
Yes, I have. Let's just say it comes to very little surprise to me that in many police forces there's sympathetic interaction between deployed crowd control police and the Proud Boys.
Who are one thing that I've been watching and I've been really, really alarmed about are these individuals popping up in Under Armour shirts around the White House in Washington who refuse to identify who they are. They just vaguely mention that they're with the federal government, and many reporters are asking, like, who the hell are these? And like, who the hell are they? Do you have any insight into that? It feels very secret police-ish or SA-ish, and I find it really, really alarming.
Yeah, so the internet has featured, Twitter has featured a lot of speculation as to the identity of these detachments, and it is definitely distressing when you see people who are not displaying insignia and who are refusing to identify which arm of the government they're with, but who are brandishing weapons and engaging in police action. So there's been some good open source intelligence where like insignia on backpacks or vests or plate carriers or things that have been inadequately concealed. These people have been able to track those, so the I've seen two sets of photos. One of which appears to feature the special operations unit of the I think it's the Bureau of Prisons. They're the ones who sort of famously just said we're with the Department of Justice and didn't provide any more information.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's also a group of people that really just look like they're a bunch of schmucks in t-shirts, right? They don't look. They do not look like a fit or disciplined special unit of the police or military. Let me put it that way. And so I'm not sure who the hell they are. But what seems to have taken place, and this speaks to the issue of militarization and perhaps the propriety of the term fascism to describe Trump's mode of governance or the Trumpist movement, is DC is the only city in which the federal government can just call out the military and saturate the place with like federal police forces from everywhere, and it seems like that is what's happened, right? So other cities certainly are featuring extensive police deployments, like New York, like Seattle, like Minneapolis, etc. But in DC, they appear to have just called up every SWAT team, every special unit of all the federal forces, CBP, ATF, the Bureau of Prisons, everyone, and just kind of stuck them there so that they can walk around and look like commandos. Because the cult of militarism and the cult of the military is part of the symbolic politics, of fascism and of Trumpism.
Self, meanwhile, has been down to the bunker 2.5 times. Whatever that means. But only to check it out. So I see Torin in the chat here. Are you home, Torin? When are you hopping on here? Maybe he's not going to answer.
Well,
us.
we've been on for an hour. Oh, there we go. Oh, great. Now I got to put his name in the right place.
Yep. Sorry. Did all our names shift now that he's jumping in?
I'll just do it live. Just the bottom two. It's fine.
Oh, and I see now that over the course it again.
Hello?
Hey, Torin. We can hear you.
Yeah, hi. Oh, great. Cool.
We can hear you. We can't see you. Simon, you froze up there for a few seconds and we lost your last comment.
I said that
Did you fart? Who farted?
I said that was a fire truck. I'm on
Sure
I'm
was.
at I'm
Sure.
on First Street. So yeah, I said I see that. Speaking of names, I seem to have been awarded my doctorate again over the course of this conversation.
Yeah, you're
Oh,
welcome.
congratulations.
Yeah.
You're welcome. You've earned it, Simon.
Celebrate more than once when a good thing happens, even if that good thing was some time ago. And he's frozen again.
Torin, have you found any penguins for this week?
Well, I am pleased to report that the Melbourne Zoo has reopened. Sorry, the Melbourne Aquarium and the Melbourne Zoo and the Werribee Open Range Zoo and the Healesville Sanctuary have opened with new limits on daily visitor numbers. And they have some, let's see if I can find it here. Actually, I'll post this in the chat so everyone can enjoy it. Bwap. And there's some new penguin chicks. So that's exciting. This is like a tiny little line in the entire article. But yes, there are 4 penguin chicks that just hatched before lockdown, which have grown much bigger. And they have a jellyfish exhibit too. So, and one of the penguin chicks is named Quentin Quarantino. Quentin Quarantino.
All right.
And the other ones are Lorraine, Sparky, and Whopper.
That is a penguin who is happy when he is near feet. Happy feet. And also, Quentin Tarantino is a foot fetishist.
I didn't know that.
We all know that. Oh, yeah, he's a total foot fetishist. Sorry, I was making a foot fetishist happy feet joke.
Oh, you think there'd be more feet in his movies? I don't remember any foot scenes.
There are. Google it, Torin.
Okay.
Like, he doesn't focus on it, but he makes sure, oh, I'm going to get a close-up of her foot. Like,
There's an entire scene in Kill Bill.
Oh,
I
wasn't paying attention during Kill Bill, so that explains that.
Yeah.
Right? Like
Uma Thurman's, I presume?
yeah.
Chat has just erupted. This is an issue about which apparently there is no controversy.
Good. Oh, all right, sure. I accept my ignorance on this front.
yeah, we've been accepting
yeah.
ignorance most of this show. It's a healthy thing to do, I think.
Yeah, so penguins are still being born and growing. So that's some good penguin news.
So that
what
means
more
they're
could we
alive.
hope for?
Hooray!
Yeah, penguins still alive. Still not vectors of coronavirus as far as we know.
As far as we
good.
know.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Anything else to add, Rob, before we go? Dr. Pratt? Anything you'd like to say?
Well, I mean, there's a few things I've got my eye on. The U.S. just passed its 2 millionth case of coronavirus sometime today. They're on track for 200,000 deaths by the end of August, which is just horrifying. But they've never managed to sink below 20,000 new cases a day, and they've just started to tick up in the last few days. And it looks like Florida, which kind of reopened a couple of weeks ago, has now had a spike of new cases right around the time you would have expected there to be a spike if there was going to be a problem related to reopening.
right.
And so we're sort of seeing the consequence of what happens if you simply reopen without the proper public measures in place of testing, tracing, and isolation of cases.
I guess you covered, while I wasn't here, I guess you covered all of what the effect of all the riots would be. But I'm just curious, like, when do we know when a case is, we say we got there are this many cases today. Like, when were those tests made and then reported? Is it like same day? Is there a few days, of buffer or?
So I think what you're asking is, when will we know if there was an outbreak from the riots?
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
So that's,
Can I just point out that we're still using this word riot?
Sorry, protests. You're right. I apologize.
Large collections of people being close to each other and shouting.
About a 5 to 2 week latency.
Oh, okay.
On symptoms and then cases, right? Because about the earliest at which you can have a detectable viral load is about 5 days after yourself becoming infected, and the latency can last up to about 2 weeks. Oh, there goes Simon again. And potentially as long as 3 weeks, but typically around 2 weeks is when we're going to start to see what the consequences
Okay.
are of. And as Simon pointed out, which I thought was a really interesting point, is if you want to see whether the protests related outbreaks are accelerated by police action,
Hmm.
which I think a lot of public health experts are very worried is in fact the case. We'll be able to tell by comparing areas that had intense, violent police action versus areas that didn't. So, um,
Right.
place your
There are
bets. We'll see you in 2 weeks.
a couple thoughts I think I might want to share before we all go our separate ways, which is that uh, the possibility for like sweeping social transformation often only really comes about during moments of general crisis. And while these protests are helping to create that kind of a crisis, the pandemic is also that crisis. The
Hmm.
pandemic has produced a certain widespread sense of urgency and emergency and pressure and frustration. And if you're watching this and you're not out protesting, or maybe you're watching this and the scale of racism and police militarization is like a new fact for you, and it saddens you and it angers you, and you feel like you have a lot of learning to do. So I think this is a really good time if you're on Twitter to go and follow some black activists and black scholars, to follow some non-white informed voices who are doing a lot of messaging, to instead of maybe asking your non-white friends to explain things to you, go out and do the research yourself. This would be a great time to dig up some research on prison abolition and police abolition. You're very welcome to go to my Twitter feed and see who I'm retweeting, because whenever I see what strikes me as a good article on that subject, I've been hitting the retweet button, and I have some really impressive fellow political scientists who fulfill those criteria in terms of perspective and voice, and I'm doing my very best to boost their profile. Um, and let's try to do our best to make this the beginning of something much longer term and much more committed, rather than an unfortunate confluence of emergency that will dissipate in a few weeks.
Excellent.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you. Yeah, yeah, I agree. That's something that I've been doing myself. I think over the last 5 or so years is starting to follow people who are not like me specifically, so that I can understand their point of view. And you can't be quiet, phone. You can't go wrong with that. You get introduced to so many new things, not just on these subjects, but all sorts of stuff, for sure.
If you want to hear how white Chilliwack is, I mean, when we were in high school, the closest thing I ever got to knowledge of what it is like to be a black person was the book Black Like Me, which was written by a white guy with a tan who pretended to be black and just hung around in a
Yeah.
black community. And I really thought that was somehow meaningful or important. And I'm not, going to say that it was unimportant what happened, but that's the closest I ever got to a genuinely black perspective on anything, and it wasn't one.
Yeah, yeah. I did when you grow up in Chilliwack, you don't know how white it is. And I remember, so I grew up in Chilliwack and moved out here to Burnaby, which has a large, varied Asian population. And it never weirded me out when I was at the local mall to be surrounded by a bunch of non-white people. But after being here for a year, I went back and visited some friends in Chilliwack. We went to the mall, and I walked around the mall going, look at all the white people. Holy, like it just was glaring at me that there was nobody non-white there. And that my culture shock was going back. And then having to realize what that meant about me being raised in that environment and stuff like that. Yeah. Yeah. We had one guy, I think, at our high school who was black. Chuck. Do you remember Chuck?
I remember Chuck.
Yeah. That was it.
Don't know if I ever had a conversation with him, but I remember him.
I have. Chuck and I got along. I don't know if we were like good friends or anything, but anyway, yeah. Welcome to well, now we're three guys from Chilliwack and Dr. Simon Pratt. Obviously not from Chilliwack. Thanks very much, everybody, for coming to watch Viral Transmissions, episode 12. I've been Joe Fulgham. That's Dr. Rob Tarswell. The guy you can't see is Torrin Atkinson, and our guest, Dr.
holding
Simon Pratt.
My fingers up like Rob.
Yeah. Victory and live long and prosper.
Live long and wipe your hands. Wash your hands.
Black Lives Matter. First Nations lives matter. The cops fucking suck.